You're listening to The Switch. The Switch is a podcast about ideas and experiences that change our minds. I'm your host, Chase Harris, joined, as always for this episode, by my co-host, Alex Berner. This week, week 5 of Outwitting the Devil. We start with a recap of last week's exercise about analyzing temporary defeat, and then we move into this week's principle. Be willing to render useful service equivalent to the value of all material things you demand of life, and render service first. We discuss a couple of questions. What does that mean? What is useful service? How does that idea connect to the ideas of karma, charity, etc.? Should you give without expecting to receive? Then we present the exercise for this week and split off into breakout rooms at the end. This podcast is produced by Mojo Filter Media. That's our audio company specializing in audio production for interactive media. Even if you just need your band's music mixed, or if you've got a full-blown video game that you need scored, sound designed, etc., head on over to www.mojofilter.media. This is, of course, a Patreon-funded podcast as well. By no means is it necessary. However, if you do find what we're doing valuable, you can head on over to patreon.com/switch_podcast. Feel free to pledge as little as $1 an episode, and that unlocks the occasional bonus content, things like extra interviews when we have guests, things like that. Last but not least, you may have noticed in the last couple of episodes that we have a live audience present who gets to ask questions and be part of the discussion. If you would like to be part of that discussion, head on over to meetup.com/52livingideas, where we are hosted graciously by the 52 Living Ideas Meetup community. They've got a whole bunch of great topics around there, and every Monday we record the Switch podcast with a bunch of members of that community. So, without further delay, I give you week 5 of Outwitting the Devil. So, as always, I'm going to try to start with my ever-condensing recap for anyone who has showed up this week for the first time. This is actually week 6 of our Outwitting the Devil series. Week 5 of our Outwitting the Devil series. For anyone who's never read the book, Outwitting the Devil is by Napoleon Hill. He wrote Think and Grow Rich. Long story short, studied a bunch of success and failure in the 1930s, if I'm remembering correctly. Was a friend of Rockefeller, or an acquaintance of Rockefeller. And Outwitting the Devil was a book that was too, we'll call it, politically incorrect to publish back then, 1939, when he completed it. It didn't get published after he died by his children. It didn't get published until 2011. And the reasons for that, when you read the book, I think are relatively obvious. It's a dangerous book to put out because it takes aim at many institutions of society that are doing harm, but that have the capability to bury you if you shout them out. For example, religious institutions and schools and governments. Anyway, the thrust of the book is this. 98 out of 100 people are what he would call drifters. People who have aims and goals, but do not proceed toward them for whatever reason. And he talks about the reasons. Or people who just don't have aims and goals to proceed toward. And regardless of which camp you fall in, 98% of people will fall into one of these camps and drift away from their ideal future selves that they could be. Now, the book is a conversation between Mr. Earthbound, Napoleon Hill, and the devil himself, who is bound by some rule that he cannot lie in this conversation. And it's a back and forth where Mr. Earthbound is interrogating the devil about all the ways that he leads people off of the path and onto the path of drifting, away from their aspirations, goals, material desires, everything. So in our series here, we've taken a list from the book of 11 principles that the devil admits are ways to stave off drifting. And each week we'll be analyzing one principle. Now, we'll start today's discussion with a very short recap of last week's principle and any feedback anyone has on the exercise, what Alex and I got from the exercise. We'll keep that pretty short. And then we'll move on to this week's principle. Don't worry, if this is your first time showing up, it is very easy to jump into the discussion. You'll see how things go. It's great. Stick with it. After the discussion, we'll try to wrap up around the 50 to 60 minute mark. We will have breakout rooms where we will split into small groups and discuss the principle and exercise from this week. And then we'll come back together into the main room to talk about our takeaways. So that's about how tonight's going to run. We'll try to keep it brief, on topic, courteous, etc. All right, so last week, the principle was analyze temporary defeat, or more verbosely, analyze temporary defeat no matter of what nature or cause, and extract from it the seed of an equivalent advantage. And now one thing to clarify, we did say that the wording for some people didn't make as much sense. So defeat has a specific connotation. Feel free to replace defeat with adversity, failure, whatever floats your boat. So analyze temporary adversity, analyze temporary failure. And we had an exercise that essentially gave a metric or gave a method for analyzing temporary defeat. So before we get feedback from anybody who completed the exercise in our live audience here, Alex, what did you get from going through this specific exercise? How did your week go? What did you do in terms of analyzing defeat?
So the main thing that came to mind for me, and I started this off in our little 5-minute thing, was back in college when I failed a literal failure, my basic piano class. And it was the first time I ever failed a class, and it just felt so bad, right? I was after it, and I really had a lot of the blame on my professor because we didn't get along. I felt like he put extra pressure on me. It created an environment where I didn't want to learn, where I was resentful of having to do what I did. And then I just didn't do the final exam and, obviously didn't pass the class. And I feel like this is an important one for me because I saw what it looked like to not draw a seed of equivalent advantage and then to switch around and do that. So at first, I just let it stew in my mind, like that kind of resentment and frustration and anger. And that was because I had failed. But upon further reflection and meditating and really learning more about myself and doing stuff like these exercises, I was able to go meet with him and get just the emotional, baggage I had with that class, let it go, and more or less just forgive him for being nasty to me. And I was able to find a teacher who actually encouraged my growth and made me really enjoy playing. And I was able to get past that. So I feel like the seeds that I gained for that was first just confronting failure in an absolute form that I had never had to deal with, and thus afterwards having it not be so scary. And also, because I had such a bad experience, I made the extra effort to go and find a professor that I really liked and that really encouraged me to grow. And since then, I've loved playing and getting better, even though it's a difficult thing for me. So I feel like that was a very long process, and it was the thing that really taught me about this.
Awesome. So, yeah. There's a question that came up for me in this exercise that I wrote down in our notes, which was, what is the advantage? In my future self's story, what will this serve as the turning point for? And as I was going through various defeats and, analyzing them to one degree or another, this question sort of stood out to me. On the one hand, things that were minor defeats that were very obviously temporary, that question, it almost doesn't make sense. Like, small failures, like failing a homework assignment in college, however many years ago, or, losing my cool at work or something like that. Those don't necessarily seem like they serve as turning points. So, in that sense, that question doesn't make sense. But for large failures or large points of adversity, I think that I almost always characterize them as, what is the significance of this in my life's story? So uh, I think that's one of the big takeaways for me, is to just really solidify that mindset when there are large chunks of failure or defeat or adversity, is to ask myself that question. Now, the other tool set that comes to mind for analyzing defeat that came up for me a lot this week was stoicism. And we've talked about this before. We've talked about this, in plenty of other podcast episodes. You and I have talked about this off air. For me, the dichotomy of control, which some people don't necessarily like that framing of stoicism, but specifically the dichotomy of control is an invaluable tool set for analyzing adversity of any kind. And it goes something like this. So there are essentially two categories of things. There are things that are under your complete control and things that are not. And things that are under your complete control are things that, essentially you decide, your own thoughts, your own actions, things like that. It's obviously much more nuanced than that. And then things outside of your control. And this is really the focus, because I think this is where most people don't see things properly. Things outside of your control are things like other people's actions, other people's opinions of you, anything outside of you that happens environmentally. And I think that when you analyze defeat or failure or adversity under that metric, in my mind, that's how I get the most out of it. Because as soon as I start lasering in, it's like I'm literally using a laser on the story that I've constructed around some situation of adversity or failure, and slicing off, like lightsabering off, big chunks that might have some emotional weight to them because they're totally out of my control, right? And what I'm left with is this like finely crafted, carved analysis of the choices that I've made, or the choices that I made in that situation that led to that specific outcome. And because it's so clear, it shows me the path forward and shows me the equivalent advantage to extract from it, especially if it's don't do that again, or here's how I should act next time. That's really the main thing for me. So I don't know that I've got much more to say on the exercise than that. Alex, do you have any other words before we switch to?
Yeah, just to add your story, take what you said out of to mine. I agree. I feel like that's also something I missed to say that was a seat of equivalent advantage, was that I had responsibility over this. I had the control over the situation. There was nothing in the situation that was really beyond my control that I was upset about. So I was able to really understand that and take responsibility.
Awesome. All right. Now we'll open it up to the audience. For anybody that was here last week and that completed the exercise, let us know if you want to spend 2 minutes just talking about what you got from it, and then we will move on. If there are no takers, we can go ahead and move on to this week's. All right, Sharon, thank you for volunteering.
So I have to admit, I actually did this. I must have done it immediately after last week's meetup and just forgot about it in the busyness of the week. So, and it's personal. So what I'm sharing here is maybe, it's very personal to me. I'll just say that. So don't judge, maybe, is where I'm headed with that comment. So what I had as my to-do, find something a little extra adverse or failure and analyze the thought patterns. Is that on target? Yeah.
Yes, that was the bonus thing, was specifically to seek out failure or adversity. So awesome.
Okay, so my adversity, or actually my failure, was not doing constitutional law yet. So what I did that helped me was I reached out to volunteer. And what hurt me is I didn't do the research to find the right opportunity. And what did I do that didn't help me, but that I'll continue to do, is I will continue to pursue it. And then I had that I was supposed to answer 5 whys. Is that
Yeah.
okay? So the 5 whys. The first one was why, because I wasn't taken seriously. Why, because I didn't demonstrate the skills. Why, because I don't have them cataloged. Why, because I haven't created the documentation. And why, because I just didn't have the time. I was working and just doing everything else. So now what I'm going to do is an in-depth study of the clauses, the cases, the Federalist Papers, all the supporting documentation, and then actually create this document that then I'll go and figure out where the best volunteer opportunities are and hopefully be successful next time.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much for sharing that, Sharon. That's great. And one of the things that I really loved about your 5 whys specifically is I think it's tempting for people to, when they start asking why, to jump into the external factors. If your first why is I wasn't taken seriously, the next why, or the why for that, could immediately turn into, well, that's, other people doing the wrong thing. It's no longer under my control. But it sounds to me like you spent most of those whys focusing on specifically things that are under your control and that you can use to, like you outlined, plan what you're going to do going forward. So great. Thank you, Sharon. All right, we will move on to Joe. You have volunteered. 2 minutes, my man.
Yeah, so basically my failure was something that I had done at work where I had proposed a project multiple times and that it had not been taken up or funded just yet. I still say just yet because there is still some hope of that. But some of the reasons as I, started to look at what was, what I did that, could help me or hurt me and, what I didn't do in getting this done. Sometimes I found myself, and I kind of covered this a little bit last week, is the idea of, I started to complain about my situation a little bit, which was outside of my control. There were some people that are being closed-minded that, I was not necessarily, I was basically just blaming the circumstances that I was in. And that was something that was negative that I was doing. What I did do to help me is that I did continue to reach out to people that I thought would listen outside of the organization. So I did, I was proactive about how I approached, kind of trying to get this project funded and get my goals, essentially achieved. But some of the things that I didn't do that helped, that didn't help me was, I just allowed myself to become a little bit negative in this process. And I had a lot of negative self-talk. And, that actually prevented me from maybe being as energetic as I once was about a proposal to bring forth a new idea that would hopefully, just make it a lot easier for people to do a business analysis and engineering analysis. So I was really excited about maybe, basically structuring all our data so that everybody could access it and analyze a lot of information in a different way. And a lot of the negativity, the negative thoughts would actually get in the way of that process. So that's something I did in the past week. I reignited this actually recently with reaching out to other organizations across the entire Defense Department. But anyway, I started to discover some of the things that were outside of my control that I was still, letting them get in my way of what I could control. So.
Well, do you feel, sorry, one follow-up question for you.
Absolutely, please.
Do you feel that this exercise or this way of thinking has helped you at least begin to extract that seed of equivalent advantage?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I mean, and it builds a certain resolve that, that you keep pushing forward, saying to yourself, okay, what am I extracting from this that I can actually, what actions can I take now? And, it's a gradual process, but yes, I do.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for sharing, Joe. All right. So with that, awesome. We're doing great on time. We will move on to this week's principle. So, principle this week 5, be willing to render useful service equivalent to the value of all material things you demand of life, and render the service first. Now, before we go into discussion, I tested this out before the podcast. I hope this works. I would like to share a clip from a podcast with everyone. So we had Sean Croxton on the show a couple of months ago, and he runs a podcast called Quote of the Day. And I think it's the most popular self-development podcast out there. It's amazing. You should go check out Quote of the Day. It comes out every weekday, and they're usually like less than 10 minutes long. Well, a couple of months prior to that, he put out an episode that was a throwback to an early episode where a woman named Marie Forleo, who has this thing called the B School, it's a business development thing. She's got a podcast, she has a quote, "Giving is a great business strategy." And she tells this story in the podcast. And I don't want to ruin the story, but it has to do with this principle. So we're going to listen to her tell the story real quick. And again, this is off of Sean Croxton's podcast, The Quote of the Day. So it's like a podcast within a podcast. Anyway, we're going to listen to this story real quick, and then we will start our discussion from there. So let me go ahead and share this, and I'm going to start it playing. Give me a thumbs down if you can't hear it.
So I want to talk about the Happy Meal mistake. So the Happy Meal mistake, I love the Happy Meal mistake. So my ladies, this one's for you. Imagine you're really excited to go out on a date with a new guy. You're so thrilled, you get all dressed up, all nice. You live in a city, so he's going to come by, pick you up at your apartment. You all are going to walk to your date. So he picks you up, he's looking great, you're walking, doing good. Ooh, this is going to be awesome. And you come up to the Golden Arches. Your date takes you for a Happy Meal. Would you expect on your next date, if you had a next date, that he would fly you to Paris for a gourmet dinner? No. Many of us, with our free content, are giving away Happy Meals. And we are expecting people to pay for a trip to Paris for our products and services. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense if that's what we're doing, right? We don't want to give crap on the front end and expect people to just jump and open up their wallets and shower us with cash for our premium products and services like they're going to think they're different. So, are you making the Happy Meal mistake anywhere in your business? Is the quality of your free stuff representative of your brand, of your business, of what you want to give to the world to make a difference through the vehicle of your business? If it's not, who can change it?
All right. So the Happy Meal mistake. And I know Marie Forleo here is talking about business strategy. I would like to put forth the proposition that this is life strategy as well. This is how life reacts. This is how life is. And that's why it works for business, because it works in life. So again, going back to the wording of the principle, be willing to render useful service equivalent to the value of all material things you demand of life, and render the service first. So, Alex, do you want to talk at all about what you feel like this means? What is useful service? What did you get from that Happy Meal mistake story?
Yeah, I think it plays on our natural urge to hold back and not, like, it's an urge to not put your best foot forward, right? It's to be like, wait, I don't want to give away my biggest, best thing. What will people think of me how will I live up to that? I think it's a fear of not being able to follow, at least in my case. And it's easy to analyze this, I think, in a business setting. So maybe we can start there and kind of extrapolate, if that sounds good. So for example,
Yeah.
you're looking for a promotion, right? You can't say, well, I'm going to wait to get promoted before I start performing well.
Mm.
It's just, that's just obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of entrepreneurial people talk about how you need to make your thing the best thing for somebody to want. And then, and you can't charge them for it because somebody else is doing it for free. So it seems to be, to me, the natural direction of the, online economy. So in that way, it seems obvious and easy to analyze. So I wonder, do you have any ways that we can kind of take this away from just kind of earning recognition in business,
Yeah.
or having a business success to a personal life? Like maybe we could propose a specific example.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the business context is probably the easiest to think about it in. But I think, obviously the dating context is the next one. That's, Marie Forleo's example. But I think any of the interpersonal context, I'm thinking about like how you build and maintain friendships with people. And I think, there are different kinds of friendships. And I don't mean to make friendships sound transactional. But if you think of friendships, specifically friendships of virtue, and that means friendships where your relationship with someone is built on the fact that you hold each other to a high standard, you're interested in holding each other up to your virtues and values, and what you get from each other is not simply social grooming, social context. It's not simply being able to dominate someone. It's specifically a friendship where your relationship with the person is one of growth. It specifically breeds growth. I think the way to do that is to be willing to help the other person grow without expecting them to help you. I think the way to do that is, for example, let's take like workout buddies or something. And maybe this is too thin of an example, but if you go to the gym with someone, obviously you can have the intention of, I'm going to have a gym buddy so that I'm held accountable, and I've got this extra little social pressure to make it to the gym or whatever. But I think the way that you make that work is by giving that to the other person. The way that you make that work is by modeling exactly what you want from that person. So that's the rendering of service component of that. I think we can give examples of that anywhere in life. I don't know that we need to necessarily keep going on examples. Did you have an example that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think you kind of started to touch on it there, which is like community, right? A flourishing community is one where people, give upfront and have this kind of connection where it's really that of giving, right? And paying it forward, right? That whole idea.
Yeah.
If you think about like when somebody dies and right, they have so many people at their funeral, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of in a community nature. So
one of the other points that I wanted to bring up is the psychology of giving. And I think a lot of people, you kind of mentioned this, but a lot of people give specifically with the expectation to receive, even if they're, saying that they're not doing that. I think a lot of people do. So how do you, maybe this is a question we should open to the floor. What does it mean to give without expecting to receive? How do you actually achieve that? How do you build into your life this sort of service first approach? And in what way does that help you that the expectation to receive might hurt you, might turn that off? Do you have any ideas? And then we'll open it up. If anybody wants to jump in on this question, feel free to raise your hand in the or put an exclamation point in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's almost like a belief that you need to have to that in the end, it's all worth it, right? Like you think about people who are ideas like karma or, religious organizations where that's kind of the premise, like, don't worry, you'll be rewarded for it later. Just give. You don't need to worry about what you're going to receive. You don't need to have to weigh it against each other, receiving, giving. It'll all work out in the end. So I think that's one way in which people are able to kind of commit to this and not worry about it so much. Yeah, that was really what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I do want to mention, I think that there's a potential, a question probably a lot of people would have is, how do you not get taken advantage of, right? And I think that there's kind of a core component of either abusive relationships or, poor business strategies or, predatory environments where there's the system of giving is corrupted, right? Where you continue on like this, but the other person or organization is not basically fulfilling their end of the bargain. It's again not on paper, but what you would expect a normal actor to function as. They've kind of corrupted the process and will continue to take and take and take, and it will drive people to really bad places. Whether that's financial or emotional, mental, whatever.
Yeah. Someone in the breakout room discussion last group mentioned that, and I forget who this was, mentioned that they had a contract for some work with a big company. It was like the dream contract. And when they got into the final stages of being ready to sign the contract, or it might have even been post signing the contract, but once the work had started and there was still this sort of middle ground of figuring out how they were working with each other, the person started changing the contract. And they had this sort of crisis of conscience of, well, the person I'm working with is dishonest. They're changing the contract. They're starting to take advantage of me. However, if I were to give my all to this gig, I mean, this is the dream contract. What do I do? Do I draw the line and say, look, I'm not being taken advantage of? Or do I give everything to this knowing that I'm being taken advantage of? And I think the line in there is somewhere like what you're willing to give of your own accord versus what is taken from you, and you have to essentially accept it being taken or not. And I know that's a hard line to draw, but so I think business examples are one of the best ways to outline this principle. Again, be willing to render useful service equivalent to the value of all material things you demand of life, and render the service first. I think about the ways that we run our business. A lot of people who listen to the podcast aren't necessarily familiar. We run an audio company, Mojo Filter Media. And I think a lot of the projects that we've been working on recently are the kinds of things where we're trying to put things out there. And yeah, we are demanding of the market, material things, work essentially. But what we're putting out isn't demands for work. What we're putting out is work. What we're putting out is useful service. We're showing what we can do. We're trying to make content that is useful to people, that's interesting. And none of that's behind a paywall. We're doing our best to avoid that Happy Meal mistake of we only put out, the little bitty stuff. And then when you pay us the big bucks, then we deliver. We're trying to just deliver. And if you want it for you, then you can pay. Otherwise, we're just going to, it's going to be more of a public delivery type of avenue. Are there any other examples that you want to go over before we move on to sort of opening it up to the audience and then the exercise?
Yeah, I think just the whole, basically what you're talking about, just to highlight in a different way, like the whole premise of content marketing, right? People are looking for things to learn, grow, right? Shrikant puts this whole Meet out for free, right? We can all go watch it on YouTube. And there's no expectation of a paywall. And when you think about somebody who wants to take an audience, and I'm not suggesting Shirkant's doing this or does this or anything. I'm just using this as a different example. Somebody who wants to get somebody to pay for lessons with them, if they can show up front that they're the best teacher and that they communicate well with people, it's just, that's so much of a better sell than just getting an email and saying, "Oh, trust me, I'm the best."
Mm-hmm.
It just, and whenever you think about individual examples, I feel like this becomes obvious.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So here's the question to the audience. I'd like people to contribute to this part of the discussion. In what ways can you personally think of in your life that you may be able to render useful service? Or if you have examples that where you already have and it's worked for you, or you're waiting for it to work for you, whatever the case may be, maybe you're not expecting anything. In what ways have you or can you render useful service equivalent to what you demand of life? So we'll give everyone a second to think about that. And I would love people to share. You can even just say, 2 words. I donate my time to this. I work with that. Whatever the case may be, whatever you can think of that is rendering useful service or that you haven't done yet. Julie.
Mine's a little bit abstract, but
Take it
if
away.
I expect to get the most out of life, I got to be willing to put my all into the moment.
What do you mean by that?
Like giving it my, doing not dusting around the lamps, actually doing a good job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and in doing so, I get a reward in the activity itself.
Good. Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Sally, I see you just typed into the chat. Would you be willing to say that out loud?
Sure. Yeah, I do graphic design and web development and other things, but yeah, I recently, usually when I do volunteer work, it's for people I know. But I reached out to an organization recently to offer my services, and they took me up on it. So that's a little bit different dynamic.
Awesome. And what was the motivation for doing that? If you don't mind me following up with you.
That's a good question. I think I liked the mission of the group. And I actually offered myself in a different capacity, but then they saw what I did for a living, and they asked if I could do that as well. But I think that's a good question. I have a little bit of time right now, so maybe that had something to do with it. But usually I don't I respond to people personally in my realm of relationships. But as far as reaching out, I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to broaden my horizons.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Sally. Stephen.
Hi. The problem that I've found in trying to provide service is people's willingness to accept it.
Mm.
So during COVID, I've let my church and some neighborhood groups know that I'm available if anybody needs to do errands or has any other needs, but didn't get any response. And you get all this praise from people for making yourself willing to volunteer and share yourself, but if nobody takes it, then it's like really it's not very fulfilling.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I got a piece of advice about that once in an interpersonal context, but I wonder if it would apply to something like a community context. So I got the and it's just a framing difference. I got the advice once that when someone is in distress, I'm trying to remember the wording, but it's something like, instead of asking like, what do you need, or something like that, it's more like, what can I do for you? I'll have to remember the exact framing. Alex, maybe you know, have you ever heard that advice of like how you frame the question of how can I help you, or let me offer my service? There's one way that people tend to do it, that usually the answer is like, I don't know, or they just don't get followed up with. And then there's the other framing of it where it's more action oriented, and you tend to get do you know what I'm talking about?
What I'm remembering is basically proposing a specific solution and being like,
Okay.
"Can I do this for you?" and it being specific.
Gotcha.
But yeah, basically taking as many of those like like elements of confusion out as possible.
Gotcha.
If they have to think about what could they do, I don't want to make them do that. It just as many questions out as possible. And I don't know if this applies to you, Stephen, but if you can reduce it to the most simple possible thing where it's just yes, no, and not,
Well, that assumes you know the person, but if you know, so that makes it even harder when you don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that may not
You're,
apply
you're right.
that may not apply necessarily to your context, but I'm wondering if there is a way for anybody who's, trying to render service in general, if an approach that is more of a general, I'm here if you need me, versus targeted, you seem like you need this, can I provide it? Actually, that just gave me a business idea. So thank you for contributing that, Stephen and Alex. I appreciate that. All right, Kevin. Kevin, feel free to jump in. You can unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. If
There you go.
play around my mouse, cannot get. Yeah, for me, it's giving is receiving.
Mhm.
It's make me happy as the individual need me help or lend a hand. If also from my personal experience, a year ago, for beggar people on the street, on the road, on the park, I can even people high like handsome like yourself, why you go to work? I question myself. Normally, I don't offer anything. Now, I treated their personal lifestyle. Whoever asks me, more or less, I give it to them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. And do you feel like that's had a positive effect on you, starting to give essentially, no matter what the surface level appearance or reaction of the person might be?
That moment to make me happy.
Yeah.
At least that moment, a mutual happy. Not just receiver, they needed help, I offer them.
Yeah.
They're not here give something they don't like, offer. That's not good. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Kevin. Kaiten.
Hi. So I kind of lost a little bit of the context of it. Of course, giving, it's wonderful. You feel rewarded, etc. But is this kind of in the context of, if you want something out of life, you give kind of like a tit for tat, give first and then you get rewarded as a result? Or is it like, if you want the most out of life, take risks, whatever that entails, because that's kind of the experience that you get as a reward? I mean, it sounds really wishy-washy, but I kind of lost the focus of
Sure.
all this giving stuff. Of course, it's great to give and everything.
So specifically, it's about a service first attitude toward life. And, there is some question. I would definitely, I would put myself in the camp of, you should, as often as you can, give without expecting to receive. I know that doesn't always happen. Even I don't do that, but that is the best way to render service, is to render service equivalent to what you want, but don't expect it in return. Render the service first, and know that by giving service, by rendering useful service, and rendering it before you get what you want, that is a path toward what you want. That's the way that I would frame it. I know that that's not as maybe as direct as you just stated, but I think that's as direct as I can be with it.
Oh, it's good because the key was it will open up the path that you want. So
Yeah.
that was the key. Thank you.
Absolutely. Joe.
So, really quickly, when it comes to rendering useful service, there's a number of ways, and you guys covered most of them, how to look at it. But one way is to not be tied to the outcomes anyway, and that's one Stoic principle that we, ought to be thinking about, is that, it's not about, the outcome, it's about the action. So many times when I do kind acts, I often, I don't like to talk about it. I mean, but I do them for people that I know won't appreciate them in certain cases. So I can think of a past example this weekend in the sense that somebody that is very unpleasant, that I did something for. And the reason I did it is I knew that they wouldn't necessarily, they might be very grateful for it. But what I tried to look at is the idea of maybe somebody never really did anything for this individual in the first place. And therefore, that's all the more reason to do something nice for them. But the idea is that likely the outcome of receiving anything back out of that would be there would be none.
Yeah.
Right. So what I did find joy in is the potential action of helping somebody that may have never been helped before.
Yeah.
Or treated appropriately. And I think that that's where you have to find the joy in the action. And that's, I find, to be the most important part of this render service first. It's about the service. It's not about what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most important part of this lesson, and doing things without the expectation of, and that's real charitable giving, because it's hard. It's easy to give to somebody that's going to be, to give something back, but it's not so easy to give to somebody that can't give back or incapable of giving back, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But that's the most joy that I get, is because I often look at it as this individual is really hurting.
Yeah.
And then, as I've said this before, is the best thing that you can do for someone is to let them know things are going to be okay and that they're not alone. And then, I think that that's a way of doing that. And so that's where the joy. I think that the overall thing that I'm trying to, and I went on way too long anyway, the bottom line is that not to be tied to the outcome.
Yeah.
And then that you focus on the service and your actions and your virtues first.
Joe, that's an excellent way to put it. And that's actually, so what you said is a modification on one of the exercises that I considered putting in for this week that I had in my original plan and took out because I thought it didn't resonate. Maybe we'll turn that into the exercise. So the exercise that I had heard was something like that, but not necessarily with somebody who won't appreciate it, but somebody who can't who can't show you appreciation. So for example, the easy one is donating money or something like that to a charity anonymously. Or the first example I was given, this was from a teacher in high school, was go to a drive-through and pay for the person behind you and just drive off, and don't tell anybody about it. Specifically, she said, don't tell anyone about it, because that can potentially ruin the outcomeless focus as well. Is, if you anonymously donate a bunch of money and then you go tell your friends, I anonymously donated $10,000 to this charity. Well, then you don't know for sure that you are disconnected from the outcome, because you're going to get feedback from them. You're not going to get feedback from the people to whom you have rendered this service or rendered this money. But, keeping it to yourself, that's, first of all, it's difficult because so often we are tied to the social feedback aspect of it, but it feels really good if you can anonymously give and not talk about it. Keep it to yourself. Anyway. All right. Next up is, Joe, did you want to follow up on that real quick? I see you just put a thing in the chat.
I mean, I just want to just say thank you for that, because I think the idea of this action that that you pay for the check for somebody and you walk out and you don't, but the only thing you can see is that maybe the expression on their face. That's the one thing that you can maybe hold on to. But again, you're right, not just doing it for the sake of doing it and not thinking about it. You just said it very perfectly, so thank you.
Yeah. All right, next up is going to be Priya and then Dave Tacoma. So Priya.
Yes. Hi. I was thinking about the charitable acts that this group does, and I'm learning more recently is the idea of like really listen to people. It might not be like giving a charitable in terms of money or your service. I guess it's part of a service, listening, and sometimes that when you're offering a service where all you're doing is giving your time and listening to what other people are doing, that's really all, it's probably exactly what the other person needs. It doesn't have to do with where they're looking for a solution or an answer or things to solve in their life, all the problems, but just someone to just vent, whether it is them having to vent or just talk out a idea that they have, just something along those lines, and the charitable act of us being able to listen and having the other person feel like they were heard and they had someone they could talk to when they had no one else, or they felt like they had no one at that moment, is an amazing service that we all do. And I just wanted to just thank. And this meetup is exactly what I like because of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. All right, Dave.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a little different area away from the career world and maybe from helping people, but I'm talking about the part of our life beyond our career. In my case, making music. I'm going to go to rehearsals for about 10 weeks and spending 30 or 40 hours and working with the section leaders telling me what he wants me to play, he or she, and a conductor that's correcting me and say, no, I don't want you to play it that way. I want you to play it this way. But the end result is producing some beautiful music that I'm going to enjoy, but we have a whole audience that hopefully enjoys. So from that point of view, I'm seeing about putting things in contributions with a end result later. Is that at all what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it to be honest, it's about how you're framing what you're doing as well. There is this word useful in the specific quote from Outwitting the Devil: be willing to render useful service equivalent to the value of all material things you demand. And that's an interesting qualifier that I think is really the only thing that brings us out of how do you frame it in your own mind. So depending on the situation, depending on how you're framing what you're doing, depending on how you're giving to that music environment and how you are essentially rendering your service as a musician without necessarily getting the equivalent back immediately or prior. That could definitely apply. All right. For the sake of time, we will take one more. Linda, you are it.
Oh, can I just respond to Joseph?
Yeah.
So I was born and raised in Indonesia, and people over there are not so giving. A lot of people are still struggling. And what I noticed, because I know someone who worked at fast food, and this is what happened also. Sometimes the people at fast food, sometimes people come and they don't have money, and those people, they kind of know their way around how to extract from the people behind them, because people over here in United States are very, very nice and very giving. For example, just I think 2 days ago, I heard this story. Somebody go to Panda Express and he doesn't have money, but he just ordered. And at the cashier, he was like, "Oh, I actually don't have the money." And then look at the people behind him, and then the people behind him feel bad, so the people behind him pay. And then after he get the food for free, he went out. And then like 5 minutes later, he come back. He was like, "You know what? Usually people buy with a soda. Did he buy me soda? Because it's supposedly a packaged meal." And my friend say, "Oh no, they don't buy you soda." And he was still trying to find ways to get a soda for free. Kind of argue a little bit. And then after that, he left. But this happened pretty frequently. That's why I kind of like, there's something in me, because I grew up in Indonesia and people over there has to work hard to improve their life. I feel that in America, there's a culture of entitlement, because sometimes some people are very nice. Nice is good, but nice to the point of spoiling people is not very good too. That's all my comment.
That's interesting, because I think if you look at, I would agree that the entitled attitude of the person who was getting the free food and still wanted the soda was not what I would consider a good attitude toward that situation. But, I think that's, if you look at it from the perspective of the person paying for his food, that's an outcome that, when you pay for someone's food, you're feeding them. That's rendering service, whether that person goes on to do good things or not. That's, those are outcomes that you're disconnected from. That's an interesting situation.
And it happens pretty frequently, according to my friend.
Yeah. And that sounds like someone who, needs a lot of help, not just eating, but potentially in many areas of their life. I hope that they at some point realize that they've taken advantage of all of these giving people and turn things around, but maybe not. All right. So here's what we're going to do. Oh, Alex, go ahead.
I want to hit on one thing. I think I know you started to mention this, but I do want to put one final point on the part about useful service. Because, for example, the people giving him food, it's expedient service, right? But I don't know if it's useful service. I don't know if that's useful to the guy. And I'm not making an argument for not giving people food. My point is just, I don't know if that would be under this, right? Because presumably $5 to those people isn't considerable, and it's not what to them would be like the highest and best use of their service, right? Because when you think about usefulness, I would think about things that you have a special ability or above average ability to contribute in a more useful form. Like, we're audio professionals, so we can contribute more valuable audio services. And for us to give that is giving also all the education we've got, everything we've learned, the years we've spent developing those skills. So it is of a higher value potentially than somebody who's never done it before. And I think you could say the same thing for different types of people, like somebody who's a counselor or has other types of skills could potentially render service. It's not like that's in their wheelhouse, and it could be extra useful in certain circumstances. So I guess my point is just, I don't know if just random acts of kindness would necessarily be considered useful service.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. Yeah, and I want to, in our exercise, we'll see how we can somewhat depart from the charity idea and more into the service idea specifically. So I want to do, again, our 5-minute bullet speed round for the exercise this week. So I'll present it. We'll do some brainstorming about it. At the very least, right now, what you need is something to write on. You need to write down at least 1-2 sentences worth of space, maybe even less. Let me get 5 minutes on the clock. It's going to take us less than that for sure, but 5 minutes is going. All right. So the exercise this week is continuing a little bit on our previous exercise, but if you haven't done the ideal self exercise, I recommend going back to it. But that's just a starting point. So put in your mind right now what it is you want out of life. And, for the sake of ease, I'll recommend that we stick to material things. That's not necessarily giving moral weight to those things, but that may be the easiest thing to work with on this exercise starting out. So pick something that you want out of life, material or not. I would just recommend material. And write it down real quick. You can write down whatever it is, a couple words. And the exercise for the week is to identify what useful service may be equivalent to that. But the exercise for right now, in this 3 minutes and 57 seconds that we have left, is what is the smallest thing you can think of that you will actually do that will move you forward on this path toward this outcome that you've just written down. So if the outcome is, I want 10,000 views per episode on my YouTube channel, what is the smallest thing that you can do that that you will actually execute on? If you write this down right now, you're going to do it, that will move you closer to getting 10,000 views on your YouTube video. Maybe it's make the next video. Maybe it's make the outline for the next video. Maybe it's come up with a topic for the next video. Just keep going smaller until it's something you will actually do. Define that micro next action step. And you can take maybe the next 30 seconds to brainstorm and do that. If you have it already, cool. You can look up, look at the camera, smile, tell me you've got it, whatever needs to be. Now, maybe, and if you're not done yet, that's okay. For anybody who has finished, if you wrote down something that's going to take you longer than 5 minutes to actually do, can you just say in the chat, mine's going to take longer than 5 minutes or whatever, just type that. If not, cool. But if anybody came up with something that's going to take them longer than 5 minutes, I kind of just want to know. I'm curious. Cool. Okay, so a couple of people. No worries, Stephen. Keep thinking. Okay, if you thought of something that's going to take longer than 5 minutes, is there a way you can break it down even smaller to something that'll take less than 5 minutes? Really break it down to some tiny micro next action. And if you wrote down something that's a chunk that's going to take you 20 minutes, and you theoretically could break it down into 1 or 2 minute steps, that's cool. Break it down to just one, and again, the criteria is it's something you know you will actually execute on when you write it down. If you can, go ahead and break it down and just write down one of those steps. We only got 45 seconds left. If you really can't do that, it's okay. But I have this feeling that tasks like this, or steps, next actions, really can be broken down into really tiny steps. Okay, now here's the wrapper on this whole thing. So the idea is to go out and do this as soon as possible, and then this week build a bigger picture of what all those steps look like, and just start executing on some steps. Start stepping in the direction of your useful service that you're going to render that's equivalent to what you want from life. However, if you wrote down something that you can do in less than 5 minutes, that you can do sitting right where you are, I want you to do it first thing when we go into the breakout rooms. Take the first 45 seconds or minute or 2 minutes in the breakout rooms, turn off your microphone, turn off your video if you need, and go and do it right now, and then come back into the breakout room and talk about it. Okay. So with that, that's the exercise for this week. Identify the useful service, or identify some useful service that may be equivalent to the things you demand of life, and give that this week. Render that service. So thank you all for participating. Thank you for coming and listening to the Switch podcast. Alex, before I sign us off, any last thoughts?
No, actually, yes. I think this is kind of how I've been living my life for the past year, right? I've just been rendering service in pretty much every aspect of my life. And I think it's starting to pay off.
Nice. Great. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. This has been the Switch podcast. I'm Chase. This is Alex. Thank you guys for participating. Have fun in the breakout rooms, and good night.